What would make thousands of desperate veterans march on Washington? And how did penniless farmers manage to stop banks from taking their land? In today's video, we'll uncover little-known stories from the Great Depression. These are the hidden struggles and acts of defiance that history books often skip. Stay with me, because later in this video, we'll answer both of these questions and reveal even more forgotten battles of survival.
The Bonus Army protest of 1932. Why would men who once fought for their country be forced to march against it? That is the riddle of the Bonus Army, and the answer takes us to the hot summer of 1932, right in the middle of the Great Depression. After World War I ended in 1918, Congress promised veterans a bonus. It was meant as a thank you for their service, but there was a catch. The money would not be paid until 1945. At the time, that sounded fine. The nation thought the future would always be brighter. But then came the Depression, and promises made in good times turned into bitter reminders of empty pockets. By 1932, many veterans had no jobs, no homes, and no food for their families. They looked at the bonus money, locked away until 1945, and they asked a simple question: why not now? They had fought for America, and now they wanted America to stand for them. So they began to march, first in small groups, then in waves. From across the country, thousands of veterans boarded trains, piled into old cars, or walked along highways with wives and children by their sides. They carried signs, wore their faded uniforms, and called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, a name that echoed their old wartime pride. By June, nearly 20,000 had gathered in Washington, D.C. They built camps out of wood scraps and canvas along the Anacostia River. Reporters mocked them by calling the camps Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, but the name stuck. Inside those camps, families cooked over open fires, children played in the dust, and men who once stormed trenches now waited, hungry, for Congress to act. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when hope and desperation meet in the same place? That was Washington in the summer of 1932. The veterans were peaceful, disciplined, and determined. They even set up their own security patrols to keep order. Yet every day the tension grew, because Congress debated their fate just a few blocks away. The veterans demanded immediate payment of their bonus. The House of Representatives passed a bill to give it, but the Senate rejected it. Imagine the blow, that long journey, the waiting in the heat, and then a door slammed shut. Still, the veterans did not leave. They believed persistence might win. But to President Hoover, their presence felt like a threat. He saw them as radicals, even as communists, though most were simple men with families. His administration grew uneasy, and whispers spread that the veterans would soon be removed by force. On July 28, 1932, the whispers became action. Police were sent to clear the camps. At first, it was just pushing and shoving. Then, shots rang out. 2 veterans were killed, dozens injured. Instead of calming things down, the clash escalated. Hoover turned to the Army. This was no small show of force. He ordered General Douglas MacArthur, along with his aides Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, to handle the situation. Yes, the same men who would later become World War II legends were now facing their own country's veterans. MacArthur moved tanks down Pennsylvania Avenue. Cavalry troops rode through the streets. Soldiers carried bayonets and tear gas. They pushed the veterans out of their camps, set fire to the shacks, and destroyed what little the families had left. The nation watched in shock as newspapers printed images of American soldiers driving out American veterans. Think about that for a moment. Men who had once fought side by side in France now stood on opposite ends of bayonets in Washington, D.C. What would you have done if you were there, watching the flames rise against the night sky? The Bonus Army scattered. Some limped home with nothing, others kept fighting for years. It was not until 1944, with World War II underway, that Congress finally paid the bonus in full. By then, many of the original marchers had already passed away. The protest left a scar on the nation. Hoover's reputation sank even further. Franklin Roosevelt, running for president that fall, learned from the mistake. When veterans marched again during his term, he met with them, listened, and avoided confrontation. It was a lesson in politics, but also a lesson in humanity. Looking back, the Bonus Army protest was more than a plea for money. It was a plea for dignity. It was the reminder that promises matter most when times are hard, not when they are easy. And it was proof that even the strongest patriots could feel abandoned by the country they once defended. So what made thousands of veterans march on Washington? Hunger, broken promises, and the simple hope that America would repay its debt to those who served. Later in this video, we will see how farmers and neighbors used a different kind of defiance, one involving pennies, to protect their land from banks. But the March of the Bonus Army remains one of the most haunting symbols of the Great Depression, a moment when survival and loyalty collided under the summer sun of 1932.
The Dust Bowl migration west. What would drive entire families to pack everything they owned onto an old truck and head west with no guarantee of work, no promise of shelter, and no idea if they would even make it? That was the choice faced by thousands during the Dust Bowl years, and the story that unfolded across America's highways is one of desperation, resilience, and sheer survival. The Great Plains had always been a tough place to live. Farmers battled droughts before, and they knew the soil was unforgiving. But the 1930s brought something different, something crueler. After years of overplowing and stripping the land of protective grasses, the earth simply gave up. Then came drought, year after year, turning fields to dust. It began with dry winds, then small dust storms, then came the black blizzards, clouds so thick they swallowed the sun. Dust seeped into houses, into food, into lungs. Mothers hung wet sheets over windows to try and keep it out, but nothing worked. Doctors began diagnosing children with dust pneumonia, a disease born of the land itself. Can you picture a world where every breath feels like swallowing dirt? That was daily life for farm families from Texas to Oklahoma, Kansas to Colorado. They prayed for rain that never came. They planted crops that never grew. And they watched as banks circled like vultures, foreclosing on farms that had been in families for generations. By the mid-1930s, families faced a brutal choice: stay and starve, or leave and hope. Many chose to leave. They loaded furniture, pots, pans, and mattresses onto beat-up cars and trucks, with children riding on top of the piles. Some even hitched wagons to horses and set out on dirt roads toward California. They called it the Promised Land, though none knew what promise it really held. The journey itself was punishing. Imagine driving a car held together with baling wire over roads filled with potholes in 100-degree heat, with nothing but dust in the air and hope in your heart. Families camped along the roadside, cooked beans over fires, and begged for water from strangers. Some never made it past the desert, their cars breaking down beyond repair, their money running out. And yet they kept coming. Between 1930 and 1940, over 2.5 million people fled the Dust Bowl states. California alone saw over 300,000 arrivals. Towns along Route 66 were flooded with migrants, so many that locals gave them a name, Okies, even if they came from Kansas or Texas. The word carried contempt, marking them as poor, desperate outsiders. Have you ever been judged not for who you are but for what others think you represent? That was the fate of the Dust Bowl migrants. They were met with suspicion, treated as unwanted competition for jobs, and pushed into camps at the edge of towns. Newspapers warned of the Okie invasion, while children of migrants faced taunts in schools. Still, the migrants endured. They picked fruit, harvested cotton, and worked fields owned by others. Sometimes they earned just a few cents a day, barely enough for bread. Families lived in tents, in abandoned cars, even in drainage ditches. The American dream seemed far away, yet they clung to the belief that hard work might bring better days. Writers like John Steinbeck captured their struggle in The Grapes of Wrath. Photographers like Dorothea Lange preserved their faces in haunting images like the migrant mother, a woman staring out with weary eyes, children clinging to her sides. These images shocked the nation, but for the migrants themselves, life went on in a grind of endless labor. And yet there were moments of kindness. Churches set up soup lines, neighbors shared food, and sometimes a stranger along the road offered a gallon of gas or a place to rest. Even in the darkest years, humanity did not disappear entirely. It flickered like a small flame against the dust and despair. By the late 1930s, government programs under the New Deal offered some relief. The Civilian Conservation Corps hired young men to plant trees as windbreaks. The Soil Conservation Service introduced new farming methods to restore the land. Slowly, the storms lessened, and some families returned, but many never did. Their old farms lay abandoned, swallowed by weeds and silence. So what drove families to risk everything on the road west? It was hunger, hope, and the faint belief that somewhere, somehow, life had to be better than choking on dust. They became part of one of the largest migrations in American history, reshaping the culture of the West and leaving a legacy that still echoes today. Later in this video, we'll see how other Americans faced foreclosure not with flight, but with defiance, gathering at auctions to fight banks with a surprising weapon, pennies. But before that, remember the Dust Bowl migrants, for their journey remains a symbol of grit and sacrifice in a time when the land itself seemed to turn against its people.
Chicago's penny auctions. How could a crowd of ordinary neighbors stop powerful banks from taking a man's farm? And why would they risk jail just to protect land that wasn't theirs? The answer lies in the strange and dramatic events known as the penny auctions, a movement born out of desperation and loyalty during the darkest days of the Depression. By the early 1930s, farmers across America were trapped in a deadly cycle. Crop prices had collapsed, leaving them unable to pay debts. Banks moved quickly to foreclose, seizing land and equipment. In farm country, the share of sales became a grim ritual, with desperate families forced to watch strangers buy everything they had worked for, often for a fraction of its value. But in small towns across the Midwest, especially around Chicago and northern Illinois, something unusual began to happen. Neighbors started showing up at auctions, not as silent witnesses, but as a force. They came in groups, often dozens, sometimes hundreds, and they had a plan. Here's how it worked. When the sheriff began the auction, the crowd would go silent. Then, when an outsider tried to bid on the farm, the crowd would step in, sometimes jeering, sometimes threatening, sometimes simply staring them down. No one wanted to cross an entire town standing shoulder to shoulder, so bids stayed low, often ridiculously low, sometimes just pennies. That's why they were called penny auctions. A man's tractor might sell for 1 cent, his cows for another, his plow for a dime. When the dust settled, neighbors would quietly hand the items back to the original farmer. The sale was legal, the bank was powerless, and the farmer kept his land. Have you ever wondered how far you'd go to protect a neighbor? These people risked everything. Sheriffs sometimes tried to push back, but they knew the townsfolk outnumbered them. Banks threatened violence, but they rarely followed through. The sight of an entire community standing together was often enough to scare off any outsider who dared to bid. There were stories of farmers showing up with sticks, pitchforks, and even shotguns, though most penny auctions never turned violent. The real weapon was unity. In a time when everyone was poor, loyalty became more valuable than money. A farmer might have no cash to save his own land, but with his neighbors behind him, he had power. One account from 1933 in Iowa tells of 200 farmers surrounding a courthouse to block a foreclosure sale. When officials tried to proceed, the crowd shouted them down, and the sale collapsed. In another case, neighbors bid 1 cent for a farmer's team of horses, then walked them right back to his barn as the banker fumed helplessly. Of course, not everyone saw penny auctions as heroic. Bankers called them lawless, mobs undermining the system. Newspapers debated whether they were noble acts of resistance or dangerous threats to order. But for the families whose farms were saved, they were lifelines. Without them, many would have been driven into the same fate as the Dust Bowl migrants. Think about the courage it took. These were not wild men, but ordinary farmers, the same ones who went to church on Sunday and sent their kids to the same one-room schools. Yet when a neighbor's livelihood was on the line, they stood together against the banks, knowing that next week it could be their own farm on the auction block. Over time, the penny auction movement spread across the Midwest. From Illinois to Nebraska, from Wisconsin to Iowa, the stories multiplied. In some counties, nearly every foreclosure auction was disrupted, and banks struggled to enforce their claims. Officials tried passing stricter laws, but enforcement was difficult when entire communities refused to cooperate. Have you noticed that in hard times, people either turn against each other or pull closer together? The penny auctions were proof of the second path. They showed that when the system failed, ordinary people could still find justice by standing shoulder to shoulder. By the mid-1930s, New Deal programs began to ease the pressure. Federal laws slowed foreclosures, crop prices stabilized, and farmers found some breathing room. As the immediate crisis passed, penny auctions faded, yet their legacy lived on as a reminder that power does not always rest with money, but with unity.
The Scottsboro Boys. What happens when truth no longer matters and survival depends not on facts, but on the color of your skin? That was the terrifying reality faced by 9 young men in the spring of 1931. Their names became a symbol of injustice, whispered across the nation, yet their full story is often forgotten. It began on a freight train in Alabama. The Great Depression had driven thousands onto the rails, young men without work hitching rides from town to town. On March 25, 1931, 2 white women, Ruby Bates and Victoria Price, were also aboard. When a fight broke out between white and black riders, the black men drove the whites off the train. Humiliated, the white men ran to the nearest sheriff, and the 2 women accused the 9 black teenagers of rape. Have you ever thought about how quickly a lie can spread when people want to believe it? Within hours, the 9 boys, aged 13 to 19, were dragged off the train and thrown in jail. They were poor, black, and strangers in a Jim Crow South that already judged them guilty. By nightfall, mobs gathered outside the jail, ropes in hand, demanding blood. The governor called in the National Guard to protect the prisoners, but protection did not mean justice. In less than 2 weeks, the boys were put on trial in Scottsboro, Alabama. The court was packed, the jury all white, and the defense lawyer unprepared. Testimony was shaky, evidence thin, but in the fever of racial hatred, none of that mattered. The verdict was swift. 8 were sentenced to death. The youngest, just 13 years old, spared the chair only because of his age. Imagine that. Children condemned to die after a trial that lasted only a few days. Newspapers called it justice, but others across the country saw something darker. The case sparked outrage. The Communist Party and the NAACP both rushed to offer defense. Rallies broke out in New York, Chicago, and even overseas. The Scottsboro Boys became a rallying cry, a test of whether America could live up to its own promise of fairness under the law. Appeals began, and with them a long and grueling battle. The Alabama Supreme Court upheld most of the convictions, but the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in, ruling that the boys had been denied proper counsel. A new trial was ordered, but even then injustice continued. Prosecutors pressed forward, juries remained stacked, and year after year the trials dragged on. One twist shocked many. Ruby Bates, one of the accusers, recanted her story. She admitted the charges were false. She even took the stand for the defense. Yet even that did not set the boys free. The machinery of prejudice was too strong, grinding down truth beneath the weight of fear and hatred. Have you ever asked yourself how it feels to wait years in a cell knowing freedom might never come? Not because of what you did, but because of who you are? For the Scottsboro Boys, that wait stretched into decades. Some spent nearly 20 years behind bars before being released. Some never fully escaped the shadow of the charges. The case shaped history. It forced the Supreme Court to expand the right to adequate counsel, and later to insist on juries that included black citizens. It laid groundwork for the civil rights battles that would come in the 1950s and 60s. But for the boys themselves, the victories were hollow, coming too late to restore stolen youth. In the Great Depression, when hunger and joblessness dominated the headlines, the Scottsboro case revealed another truth, that survival was not just about food or money, but about justice itself. For millions of Black Americans, the Depression meant double suffering, economic and racial, and the Scottsboro boys stood as proof. So what was their crime? Riding a train in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong color skin. And what was their punishment? Years of stolen freedom, branded as criminals until their last breath. Only decades later, long after most had died, did Alabama issue pardons, an apology that arrived far too late. The Scottsboro boys' ordeal was not a side story of the Depression. It was a mirror, showing the nation its deepest flaw, and it left behind a haunting question. When survival demands justice, but justice bends to prejudice, who really survives? Later in this video, we'll leave the courtroom and step into the shanty towns called Hoovervilles, where families who lost everything built fragile cities of wood and tin, proving that even in ruin, people can create community.
The rise of Hoovervilles. What happens when thousands lose their homes at once, with no money for rent and no roofs to sleep under? Do people scatter as beggars, or do they build something new from nothing? That question was answered during the Great Depression by the rise of the shanty towns known as Hoovervilles. By the early 1930s, the collapse of banks and businesses left millions jobless. Without work, families fell behind on rent and mortgages. Evictions became daily events. Furniture dumped on sidewalks while mothers clutched children and fathers searched in shame for options. With no safety net, desperation grew. But Americans, stubborn by nature, did not simply vanish into the streets. They built. Across the nation, from New York to Seattle, empty lots and city parks began to fill with makeshift shelters. People scavenged scrap wood, tin sheets, cardboard, and whatever could be nailed together. The structures were crude, often leaning, with roofs that leaked in rain, yet they offered shelter from cold nights. Soon, these clusters grew into sprawling camps. Reporters, mocking President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the Depression, gave them a name: Hoovervilles. The word stuck, carrying both sarcasm and bitterness. To live in one was shameful, yet also unavoidable, as thousands joined their ranks each month. Have you ever thought about what it means to build a city out of garbage? That was daily reality. Huts lined muddy pathways, fires burned in barrels, and men searched nearby dumps for scraps. Inside the shacks, families slept on piles of rags or straw. Hunger was constant, but community spirit slowly took root. Seattle's Hooverville became one of the largest and most organized. At its peak, it housed over 1,000 people. Residents established rules, elected leaders, and even created a justice system to settle disputes. It was poor, dirty, and fragile, but it was also a community. In other cities, Hoovervilles sprang up near rivers, rail yards, and bridges, forming a shadow society of the forgotten. Yet survival there was no easy task. Winter brought bitter cold and disease spread quickly in the cramped conditions. Police sometimes raided and burned the shacks, forcing families to scatter, only for them to rebuild days later. City officials called them public nuisances, while residents called them the only lifeline they had. One story from Central Park in New York captures the desperation. Families built shacks right inside the park, in full view of wealthy passers-by. The contrast was shocking. Homeless Americans surviving in huts of tin and tar paper, while only blocks away, grand hotels glittered with luxury. The Hoovervilles stood as a visible reminder that prosperity had collapsed. Irony ran deep. Some residents joked that they lived in Hoover hotels, cooking Hoover stew, a thin soup of scraps, and wrapping themselves in Hoover blankets, which was really just old newspapers. Humor softened the pain, but the bitterness was clear. Many truly believed the government had abandoned them. Have you ever asked yourself how you would hold on to dignity when stripped of everything? That was the silent struggle in Hoovervilles. Men who once worked in offices now begged for coal. Women who once kept tidy homes now boiled weeds for soup. Children grew up among shacks, their playgrounds made of junk, their futures uncertain. And yet, in these fragile towns, acts of kindness bloomed. Neighbors shared food, strangers pooled coins to buy medicine, and makeshift schools sprang up for children. They were poor, but they had not lost all hope. Even amid ruin, the human spirit looked for ways to endure. By the late 1930s, as New Deal programs took hold, relief efforts expanded and jobs slowly returned. Many Hoovervilles were dismantled, their residents moving on. By World War II, most were gone, leaving behind only photographs and memories. Yet the word Hooverville remained, etched into history as a symbol of failure, resilience, and survival. So what happens when millions lose homes with nowhere to go? They build their own cities, fragile yet alive, and call them Hoovervilles. And what do those towns teach us today? That even when the system breaks, people will create order out of chaos, refusing to surrender completely.